By 4 a.m. on day 1, October the 4th, of the entire nationwide invasion, including within the Albuquerque battle space or area of operations, which essentially were overseen by the 3rd Armored Brigade of the Iranian Regular Army, not to be confused with their IRGC ground forces, as well as the Pak1stani Army 18th Infantry Division, including its 2 comprising brigades, as well as its independent headquarters and independent support company at the division level, while they had headquarters battalions at the brigade division. And now, these forces had performed impressively and were rapidly, in merely just 4 hours' time, achieving enormous things as their primary responsibility was to capture and overrun the Kirtland Air Force Base left to the Iranian Army's 3rd Armored Brigade to achieve that honor for their nation and its nuclear weapons program, as beneath was a treasure trove of all kinds of live weapons in storage, as well as components of weapons that were being dismantled or maintained, having maintenance done, as well as schematics. They would use this to boost their power in the Middle East, and China and Russia, the leaders of the coalition, were more than happy to accommodate. As Pakistan already had nuclear weapons, it was a firm ally of China for a long time, and their ties grew only closer. And China was in the process of overhauling the Pakistani military when the invasion had kicked off, when it had been decided by China and also Russia to begin the invasion. And although Pakistan had not fully integrated a drone doctrine, they at least were able to train troops at the company level to operate these quadcopter reconnaissance assets and constantly monitor the combat data links, which would receive the input from the artificial intelligence real-time battlefield data processing of the Chinese, which the Pakistani forces of the coalition, the Iranians, also the Belarusians, and even North Koreans and others that had available technology were grafted into this system as it pertained to their ISR capabilities and their combat data links, which fed back the data from the ISR network, which was in turn processed by the artificial intelligence real-time data processing system to assist with proper targeting data, which was highly destructive, which caused far more casualties than was ever before possible, as all the fire was all ISR directed, even down to the squad levels, as although the Pakistani forces didn't have the handheld PDA versions of the combat data links that the Chinese squads and Russian squad level forces possessed, they at least had them at the company level, and their troops wore radio headsets to communicate with the headquarters platoons, who in turn monitored the live feed processed by the AI systems and relayed the information over the radio back to their troops, allowing them to still perform impressive feats. As it pertained to the Iranians, they were much further along in their technological overhaul of their armed forces. They even contributed their Mohajer-6 high-altitude armed recon drone in this particular battle space, which was grafted in as well to the Sino-Russian artificial intelligence real-time battlefield data processing networks. And they also had combat data links in every vehicle when it pertained to the Iranian forces, who were performing impressive feats, having had already overrun the Kirtland Air Force Base by 2 a.m., which was also the time when the first container-disguised, container-based cruise missiles of the Russians and Chinese began to fire throughout the nation at their respective targets, which even included Kirtland, which essentially meant that the targeting data had to be changed to another target because the Iranians were now in full possession of the installation, as missiles had flown into it as the Iranians were literally entering the base by smashing through its flimsy fencing and annihilating its security forces en route to the inside of the installation, surrounding a large number of them as they were guided by their ISR capabilities and had their full loitering munition support, as well as their own artillery support from their own artillery battalion. Even their SHORAD battalion, or Short Range Air Defense Battalion, covered the area with their Yazara 3, essentially the Chinese HQ-7 copy. It was reverse engineered and built by the Iranians. And the Pakistanis utilized the HQ-7P, which was for Pakistan, the HQ-7P, P for Pakistan. It was exported to them specifically. And the Iranians used the copy of that, effectively, the HQ-7. And these missiles were highly effective at swatting down air targets, especially helos, and they performed incredibly well as the Iranian forces had overrun the Kirtland Air Force Base and forced the remaining survivors who were not surrounded in the massive pincer attack on the installation to flee into the adjacent international airport, where they were in turn fully surrounded as an Iranian armored infantry battalion surrounded the airport from the west-facing side, while the two armored battalions moved and collapsed their comprising companies onto the east-facing side, while leaving some to go underneath and pilfer through the nuclear weapons as they would send in proper crews to remove them at a later time. But for the time being, they would inspect the area and the weapons, as well as remove prisoners of war, which they had captured some, to the headquarters battalion of the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade. As now, the Pakistani forces, having had laid a PP-79A pontoon bridge, had been highly successful in thwarting attacks against it, although these attacks were haphazard and not well planned, if at all, which included even American military forces and even paramilitary forces trapped on the western side that were trying to move toward the area and were utterly annihilated by the combination of the Combat Engineer Battalion, Mechanized Infantry Battalion, even a forward deployed battery of the 57mm radar-directed air defense guns, which they didn't need the radar to use them at ground targets, which were on the backs of trucks. And they sent their forward-deployed company of these, as they had 3 companies of these Type 59-1s, and they had 4 companies of the HQ-7Ps, the missile-based systems that were earlier mentioned. And they also had their headquarters and support company within the SHORAD battalion, and they moved their air defense guns up of one of their 3 air defense gun companies of the 57mm guns and fired into the flanks of the attacking armed reactionary civilians and utterly annihilated them, while the combat engineers held open the route, and even the others on the other side assisted with the final destruction of Alpha Company of the 298th, an entirely different battalion that had fled the area with one of 2 mechanized infantry companies belonging to the 1st of the 200th of the New Mexico National Guard. As Alpha Company put up a valiant fight considering all they were up against and managed to effectively nearly completely destroy an entire Pakistani mechanized infantry platoon, the 5 vehicles of the platoon were destroyed, as well as many of its troops, leaving very few survivors, which continue to fight on against the tanks with their heavy weapons, with assistance up the street in an apartment complex from the equally heavily equipped combat engineers who fired their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, as well as their Al-Qatan one-time use anti-armor weapons, which were capable of destroying main battle tanks, as these were very powerful one-time use weapons. And the ballistic computer laser range finding system could be detached and attached to a fresh tube with the fresh weapon inside. As this was the case with the mechanized infantry forces thoroughly destroyed by the combat engineers, and the combat engineers and mechanized infantry troops of the Pakistanis destroying Alpha Company, and mortar attacks, as well as also combat engineer forces, as the mortars were part of the mechanized infantry battalions, as there was 1 mortar or fire support company in each battalion, as the combat engineers effectively destroyed the American paramilitary troops as they were on the western bank as well and moved south to engage and destroy them with other armed reactionary civilians that happened to be in the area. Although loitering munition support was provided, as there was an extremely high demand on these weapons for the entire battle, committed were effective and managed to take out an ample number of armed reactionary civilians as well, as the mechanized infantry troops are heavily equipped with a IAL-5, enormous, powerful 40mm monster of an autocannon, as well as a heavy machine gun on the turret, a 12.7mm W85 or Pakistani license-built copy, while the APC version, which is following behind, so each platoon had 1 IFV and 4 APC versions, had a simple machine gun turret thereupon with the W85 anti-materiel heavy weapon. These machine guns were still very highly destructive for a machine gun, and the 40mm autocannon was a monster. They decimated the American vehicles, which even included the Bradley IFVs, as the Bradley was effectively not capable of taking on the Al-Fad IFV version, and its 20mm autocannon, though very powerful and destructive, and even its 2-tow missiles, were simply not enough, as the ISR assets guided the combat engineers into a flanking maneuver that had destroyed them, and thoroughly so, as the Bradleys, and especially the very weakly armored M113 APCs, would fall prey to most of the weapons deployed against them, with the Bradley being marginally stronger than, of course, the M113, but still not safe when it came to the 40mm, which would blast the Bradley into pieces, as it were. As now, the combat engineers that had moved in from the brigade that was on the western side of the river predominantly, with this being its headquarters battalion, as well as this armored company that was part of it as well, had moved in to surround and clear the flanks of a militia-type force that had been informed by fleeing refugees that during their ordinary travels late at night had seen the movements and aircraft overhead, and of course the militia-type personnel had seen some of these scores of aircraft, but probably assumed it was their own, but they were flat out wrong. And as the refugees had hurriedly left, taking only what they could carry just to get away from the hot zone, which was intelligent, they had encountered these personnel and told them of what was going on, as they had passed some of their members who returned and promptly told them, and they mounted up and moved into an area where there were already others materializing, and the ISR assets guided the combat engineers to surround them, and they were not aware they were even being surrounded, as they lacked any sort of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, as the anti-satellite strike, the cyber attack at the same time at midnight, and the local electronic warfare assets that were upon the JH-7 monster of a ground attack aircraft capable of carrying almost 20,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, dropped or fired, or a combination thereof, as well as precision or free fall, and of course air-to-ground missiles. These aircraft carry the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, some of the latest and greatest in electronic warfare anywhere in the world. And as they were about to have to do an RTB to refuel and rearm, as they had used up the vast majority of their munitions on the Kirtland Air Force Base, assisting the Iranian forces, conducting precision strikes on large groupings of American forces, clearing them out of the way, as well as also the tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missile strikes from the Pakistanis and even the Iranian 7th Al-Hadid Missile Brigade of the IRGC Missile Forces, their paramilitary forces that had the missiles under their control, essentially, effectively. And they fired the Shahed-2s, which smashed into the installation, along with Chinese cruise and ballistic missiles fired from not only their active duty battalions within their 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades from the Eastern Theater Command of China, but they also fired from their called-up battalions of reservists that had reinforced them to bolster the amount of firepower they could fire at a single time, as these extra battalions were assigned their own weapons to use to increase the volume of firepower throughout the entire south-central invasion sector, of which they were responsible, as the Pak1stani 176th Missile Artillery Regiment and the Iranian IRGC 7th Al-Hadid Brigade were very helpful in the endeavors in New Mexico, especially. They fired nowhere near the volume of missiles that China and even Russia fired throughout this entire campaign. However, their contributions were definitely noted, as the Shahed-2s themselves had done massive damage on the installation, and the Pakistanis, with their precision subsonic terrain-hugging cruise missiles, which had a medium range at 470 miles, the Babur Alpha 1s, had precision-struck the bridges all up and down the river, which was an enormous contribution, as the Pakistani forces also laid the pontoon bridge for their own use to prevent, of course, anyone else from utilizing this, as all the other bridges were taken out for the express purpose of trapping these forces. As by now, again, the combat engineers had moved into their ultimate destination, which was to effectively block any retreat by military forces across the last remaining bridges. As per CCP regime edict, they were not to be destroyed, as the highway infrastructure was considered critical for the post-war colonization plans and economic exploitation of the former sovereign nation. As now, the armored battalion moving into the area had again collapsed on this area, but the forces that had fled, not just from an enormous artillery barrage into the west of the city, but also from advancing mechanized infantry forces of this battalion that had begun to the immediate east of the armored battalion, were now trapped in an area where they were about to be completely cut off and destroyed, and the combat engineers would even assist in this effort, along with massive artillery strikes on both sides of the river as the Americans would try to cross. This battalion of the other brigade on the east side of the river would fire enormous volumes of shells against the American forces, especially targeting their headquarters platoon, which was their logistical and command assets to decapitate the company, which was of the first of the 200, the Mechanized Infantry Company, the last one still remaining, as they had a support platoon as well that got lost in downtown and was being virtually shelled at exactly the same time as this occurred, as they had hid temporarily in parking garages and were emerging to make their great escape. As again, this was one of the ways that they were aware that they could protect their vehicles, as this was common knowledge among military leaders, as they knew about hardened structures and they knew the parking garages, that especially multi-floor, which are made to hold tens of thousands of tons of vehicles, would effectively be an excellent place for the vehicles to hide, at least for it ended. The companies had new shell cause the cause also strike would come in from the container-based missiles, as they would have their targeting data changed and would begin to strike certain areas in the downtown. Bivouac areas were completely, and they were related to craters, other areas that they would reach the that were in for Kirtland in case the capture of it took a bit longer than 2 a.m. and would fire in the downtown area, as this has already occurred. The Americans had hid and now had emerged, and now were racing to escape at the same time as armed reactionary civilians were running through these neighborhoods immediately to the north of the park, as well as also some that were inside that were about to be cut off, as again, the AI data processing real-time battlefield system of data would inform the armored forces on exactly where to move, where the terrain was suitable for their vehicles to cross, including inclines in the ridges that were not too steep that even the tanks could climb. And as a result of this type of steady feeding of intelligence and more, and targeting data, as well as data that improved soldier safety, the Pakistanis had a major edge over their opponent, although the Americans, in this case of their mechanized infantry, unlike the other company that was virtually destroyed before they were even really able to do much of anything, would try to put up the best fight they could. As we go to the map, the air power, as mentioned previously, would be doing their RTB shortly, which would temporarily free up, in terms of the electronic warfare assets, the usage of radio sets by Americans, including the armed reactionary civilians, as the JH-7s would be briefly returning to base, where the ground crews would work like pit crews to ensure they were in good order before refueling them and sending them on another sortie, as that would take a few hours' time as they worked extremely quickly. And the bases that were forward to attack the country were not very deep inside of Mexico and were camouflaged by satellite dazing technologies of both China and Russia. These aircraft could now return to these areas as air superiority over the United States had been assured, and even if there was any surviving American air power, the sheer amount of layered air defenses all throughout the nation from all of these Chinese and Russian forces especially, but others would simply knock them out of the skies, as China and also Russia as well had outstanding air defense, integrated air defense networks and systems, including those that were able to move up with their troops and shield them in multiple layers, high altitude, low altitude, medium altitude, etc. As now, the Pakistanis in this area were comprised of two combat engineer companies who some had taken position on the roofs of these buildings, which were essentially, this was a touristy-oriented area just to the west of the Rio Grande River. In this area, this was a working-class neighborhood with smaller houses, with small yards, and to the south, near the highway, near I-40, was a gas station, a shopping center with a few different shops, and slightly larger homes than what sat to the north of the National Petroglyph Monument, as the tank company of the armored battalion that was attacking in this direction had their tank platoons line up in two columns, and they effectively moved through the area firing in an L vector of fire, as all their tanks also had interlocking fields of fire. As they scanned their sectors of fire, their targeting information from the ISR assets would be radioed into them, although some of these vehicles also had combat data links, as although the Chinese were effectively the creator of these tanks, the export versions of their equipment sometimes didn't have all the same features as their domestic equipment. However, some were in the process of being installed, as the Pakistani military, once again, as mentioned previously, was in the process of an overhaul, as China was assisting them in doing so. Barely half a mile to the north of this map, enormous artillery fire had already slammed the area with enormous volumes of 155mm shells, fired from the Pak1stani artillery battalions comprising batteries of these howitzers that were located on the western side of the river, as their other brigades, howitzers of their other divisional artillery battalion of the other brigade, was firing now against the American forces as they moved into place to attempt to bust through the Pakistani lines of their combat engineer forces. And as these mechanized infantry troops had moved just north of this battlefield and had pursued these fleeing armed reactionary civilians, as the ISR network had informed them, including the WZ-8 high-altitude stealth recon drone, the 4-post drone, and even the Mohajer-6 could survey wide areas of the battlefield, as this was a 30-mile north-south by 15-mile east-west battlefield, and they were very high altitude. They could zoom in and see all manner of activity, and the quadcopter company level assets even more so, who mapped out the battlefield in real time for the AI processing to occur as these forces moved in. The tank company in this area moved to link up and pinch off those that were in the chimney here, as it could be called, of the monument of the national park, as there would be three companies attacking from the west as they curved into the area and fell onto this spot of the national park to block escape to the west and north. They effectively would send in one armored infantry company, two tank companies moving in from the west, and they would send one tank company moving south, and all would link up and move in to support the combat engineers already here, already holding the line against the American assault. As the armored battalion would also assist the combat engineers in fending off any remaining armed reactionary civilians that were still located in this working class neighborhood, and even the mechanized infantry battalion moving in, not very far at this point in time, would be firing their 81mm mortars in support, mostly in their specific zone, but also a bit to the south, to hit targets that their company's quadcopter assets had been tracking, as it went with the 81mm LLR French-made mortars and their M106, which essentially was the M113 converted into a self-propelled mortar-carrying vehicle, These mortars were highly effective and could sustain a very high rate of fire, and could be readjusted relatively fast as well, even faster than artillery. But when firing at the same target, repeated mortars could be fired over and over at a high rate. As artillery gun crews, some were very fast and proficient at their jobs when firing at a single target. There are some crews that can get out 3 or 4 rounds a minute, although to sustain a rate of fire like that, it could overheat the howitzer, and it's often not done very often. As in this case, the mortars, the Pakistani artillery on both sides, even a lone Chinese J-10 fighter who had not as of yet dropped its limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions, as again, the fighter aircraft, such as the J-10s of the PLAAF of the J-10 squadron, committed specifically just to this battle space, as well as also the Pakistani Air Force's JF-17B squadron, had carried mostly air-to-air munitions, as their role was to ensure air superiority over the battle space for the coalition forces on the ground. And the JH-7 had 2 roles: to jam electronically redundant American communications and ISR capabilities, such as radars, portable radars that were not dependent on satellite or internet for functioning and thus were not affected by the tandem strikes at the opening of the invasion, and also to drop massive payloads on enemy targets, whether in close air support role or even more in a strategic role in some ways, as they could fly en masse and all drop their thousands upon thousands of pounds of HE or cluster or other types of munitions, or even fire air-to-ground munitions such as the KD-88. As these aircraft were very powerful indeed, they had dropped most of their munitions in support of Iranian forces at the opening stages, and were now about to do their RTB with the other aircraft, all flying in unison as they would return to their bases in Mexico. As now also the Mirage 5s would be firing the last of their missiles in this battle as well, as this battle map actually begins minutes into it. It is a 35-minute long battle, which includes the time the Americans took to roll into place, as here it is a gory scene, as this is essentially war. I mean, you got artillery shell coming in here, 155 millimeter. One landed inside of this building, smashed through the roof, and blew the outside of this large building into pieces. This man took some shrapnel from the outer radius of the blast, and so did this man behind the APC. This man was unaffected, fortunately for him, but he was taking heavy fire as he returned fire with his M16A2, as was this National Guard soldier as well, this infantryman returning fire with his M16. This man had been hit effectively in the head multiple times, in the chest as well, by 12.7 millimeter fire, which ripped right through his armor and shredded him to essentially no more. And this essentially was happening to many of the combatants, and even some of the Pakistani combatants would lose limbs in this battle, and the Russian medevac forces would return to the battlefield in the Albuquerque AO to medevac the maimed soldier, because the Bradleys would fire 2 of their TOW missiles before they were totally destroyed by all of the incoming fire from these missiles, and also anti-tank missiles, 12.7 millimeter fire, 7.62 by 51 NATO fire from the MG3s, which had a very high rate of fire. All these rounds are smacking into the brick wall here that they're taking cover behind on the curb. This man has been taken out right here, essentially. And this soldier on the other side of the IFV is firing upwards, as there would be Pakistani troops on the rooftops as the Americans moved into the area, and the ISR assets of the quadcopter assets would guide in precision artillery strikes, as this shell is about to hit this area and basically annihilate this IFV and the people around it, as are these missiles, these 1,000-pound payload missiles. Effectively, they were not over 900 pounds from these Ra'ad air-fired standoff cruise missiles for attacking ground targets. They had a 340-mile range and nearly 1,000-pound payload. These were utterly devastating. This Bradley had lost its turret, had been blown off by an anti-tank weapon or a 40 mil, or both, because there were multiple different weapons being utilized all at one time. soldier had been eliminated. It was very gory, very nasty, the fighting, and the Pakistani troops would be losing forces as well, although not anywhere nearly as many as the Americans would lose, including the armed reactionary civilians. But the Pakistanis, before it was all said and done, would end up losing one of their IFVs from their one armored infantry company committed into this specific battle map, with the two tank companies moving in from the west with the armored infantry company. They would move through a valley while the additional tank company moving through from the north would meet up. They would link up early on, move into this area, and then take their positions and begin to fire at anything still left on the opposite bank with their relatively long-ranged weapons for this urban fighting. Their 125 millimeter main gun could really reach out and touch somebody, as the saying went. At the opening of the map, artillery's blasting, imminent strikes are coming in, all guided by the high altitude and quadcopter ISR assets of the Pakistani forces present, and this Chinese fighter, as mentioned, the J-10, is dropping its limited payload, which consisted of 4 1,000-pounders, which were laser-guided, dropped on this group right here, on this high ground and a bit below, hitting the technical with 1, hitting this area with 2, and hitting the other technical with 1, completely annihilating everybody beneath them. As this was a very destructive aircraft with these weapons being laser-guided and precise, so was the artillery fire from the Pakistanis. As these forces were fleeing in the valleys and the higher terrain, as this was steep elevation in terms of terrain, but there were passages, again, where the tanks could move through. They would have to move in a single file line to get through this area, and in the clefts of the rocks were hiding 2 personnel with Molotovs, and they would end up drenching one of these Pakistani tanks by moving out from hiding behind the clefts of the rocks, which temporarily hid them from, of course, view, but once they revealed themselves, they were rapidly seen and cut down. But in the process, they managed to get 4 Molotovs onto one tank as the flaming liquid seeped into the cracks in the engine compartments and more. The tank began to catch ablaze, and the system for putting out the fires within the tank had effectively failed, and ammunition was about to cook off. The other tanks would leave it and continue on their path and send recovery assets later to take the tank back to the support company at division, as they were divisional independent companies, the headquarters and support company. They would tow it back to the divisional support company, where they had a vehicle graveyard for vehicles that could not be effectively repaired and put back into service, but they also had garages for more intensive maintenance as it pertained to their divisional forces, as they had some excellent mechanics in the divisional support company. As these forces now moved through, the artillery had already crashed onto this ridge line, including these initial blasts at the opening of the battle. As all these armed reactionary civilians are again fleeing from the earlier artillery fires, which were very heavy in the neighborhood just to the north. Most of the houses were gone. They were completely annihilated. The mechanized infantry forces moving in also contributed by firing mortar fire. An 81 millimeter mortar would land and cut down these retreating armed reactionary civilians that realized the proverbial kitchen was too hot for them, so they tried to retreat, but it was too late, and they were hit by an 81 millimeter ISR directed mortar from the quadcopter asset of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion patrolling this area and finding coordinates for targets, as was done with this technical flying down this street, along with this technical that was sitting here currently about to turn, and the mortar landed and cut them down, as well as a personnel hiding in the rubble who was effectively cut down by this. Another one landed here, destroyed these 2 homes. Artillery shell inbound from an ISR-directed 155 shell from the M198, as the artillery fire in this area was enormously heavy. Yet again, as these forces moved through the park, they were massively shelled, including this grouping of technicals trying to flee right here. These personnel got hit by the shrapnel, but by that time, these personnel had already fled. They made it between the yards of these houses. They left the park. They made it into this house before making it here and joined up with these personnel, and they were very smart. They moved out of the area and stayed under the highway as they left, but they would be tracked and hunted down and destroyed. This technical had second thoughts about joining the fighting, as the personnel in the back, in the bed of the truck, had decided to tell the driver that we need to get out of here, and they made a U-turn, but shells landed in this area, destroyed them, which could have been the shells used on these personnel, but again, they have company-level quadcopter assets that can only do so many things at once, although the forces were firing immense volumes of their weapons. There were cracks in the armor, and sometimes people could, for at least a short time, make a getaway like was done. As squads had taken to the roofs as well on these hotels, this is the welcome center for the park. These forces were engaged with these forces the moment this this line formation, which was stacked against this hotel building and moving around it with their vehicle to support them with their machine gun turret, as this was an APC Alphod moving into the area. The troops had effectively pressed up against a building and were firing along with the support from their machine gunner and their vehicle at these forces here, tearing them up as they were annihilated also by forces on the roof that had a general purpose machine gun set up there from their squad on the roof, firing their MG3 at, again, a very high rate of fire. And this round, the 7.62 by 51 NATO, could really reach out and touch somebody. It was, of course, not as powerful as the Chinese-Russian 50 cal round, the 12.7, or the American 50 cal round either, but it was an intermediate machine gun called a general purpose machine gun, and it was being fired from the roofs by these squads that had taken to the roofs early on and were firing down at enemy personnel to assist their forces on the ground, as this squad had bent around in this wedge formation and began to fire in two different ways, exchanging fire briefly with these forces who were simply just cut down from the roof-based fire and the ground-based fire at the same time. This line formation squad moved up and bounded at the same time they bounded to guard their flanks, and they cut these forces down as they moved through the area. Remember, quadcopter assets are doing everything they can. They're radioing in coordinates of enemy forces that are processed by the artificial intelligence and returned rapid fire to the headquarters platoons of each and every one of these Pakistani companies, who then are radioed to these forces and are told where to go based on that data. And they are cutting these forces down as a result. As these forces run in the gas station parking lot, another company is moving into the area to guard the rear flanks of these two companies of combat engineers that are holding the bridges against the American forces. Remember, this battle begins minutes into it, as it's a 35-minute battle, begins 15 minutes into it, and these Ra'ad cruise missiles at the opening of the map are being fired at the same time, much like so. As these Ra'ads come in, they're enormously destructive, just like these 155 shells, just like the combo of anti-tank weapons, such as this HJ-08, as well as the Al-Qatans, like so, and even the nearly ubiquitous Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, which the Pakistanis had a relatively large number of as well, although nowhere near China's stockpile, as they had built these for many decades and had an enormous stockpile of these and continue to manufacture them as well. As these forces moved up, as they were simple and reliable weapons, as these forces moved up, they peeled around this area while these forces took their own sectors of fire of this platoon right here, of this company. It has to be understood that the M60 AVLBs that were in each and every combat engineer platoon, which replaced an APC for the armored engineering vehicle in the combat engineer platoons, otherwise they were configured very similar to the mechanized infantry, but these vehicles were cumbersome in combat due to the carrying of these scissor bridges, which were basically useless at this time, so they were kept in the back. Although they had their crew within with a general purpose machine gun, the vehicle carrying the scissor bridge was again very cumbersome and was inefficient in combat situations. So they simply moved up their vehicles, and they've got troops on the roofs, and they guided everything in with artillery fire, like so right here, and on this building right here, very similar to what's occurring right here. As this scene was a common scene throughout the nation, or this, in suburban areas, or like types of areas. This was a hellishly destructive invasion only 4 hours into it, as the firepower of the coalition was far too much, far too concentrated, and far too accurate, as the drones directed everything in. Even the satellite overlays with the high altitude and low altitude quadcopter drones made a complete picture of the entire battlefield that was constantly processed by the AI and constantly rapid fired back into the headquarters platoons of these Pakistani forces and to everybody in the Chinese and Russian forces, as every squad level NCO had their own PDA version of a combat data link with their radio system as well. Although the Pakistanis weren't quite that far, they still were highly effective with their dispatch types of working through these situations as it pertained to the headquarters platoon elements like this Shangji trucks here, this fueler, this armored recovery vehicle, and this one. There's two companies again in this area. They pulled their vehicles back behind buildings to somewhat protect them a bit better from all the fire that was being exchanged. Albeit very briefly, there were armed reactionary civilians and military personnel trying to force their way across, including a technical that at the opening of the map is flying down the highway as there's an empty segment with not very many abandoned vehicles, and they're trying to maneuver through the highway, although there's abandoned vehicles everywhere throughout not just the city streets but on highways. This segment had none, and they were hauling ass, as the saying went, to try to get across. But these Pakistani troops on the roof had vectored their general purpose machine gun fire right down and into the truck and annihilated the truck. They didn't even have to direct a mortar or any loitering munitions into the truck. The machine gunner handled everything. As, again, that machine gun had a hellishly high rate of fire. It was very effective. And as these Russians were flying in, as the Pakistanis again took casualties in this very brief exchange of fire, as the Americans did not last long when the artillery and the missiles came in, even the strafing attacks, very brief strafing as they're flying at a very high rate of speed with 30mm nose cannons with their HE-AP ammunition, or HE armor piercing. They fired this into these forces and simply annihilated them, along with all the ground-based fire vectored into them from the roofs and the street level. As they did fire a few tow missiles from their Bradley, one tow missile hit and destroyed this Al-Fad APC with all its squad inside, as not all the squads had dismounted. Only 20 squads in this of the combat engineers are actually dismounted, and many of the rest are in vehicles. And as this vehicle would be destroyed, this IFV version of the Al-Fad, with its powerful 40mm autocannon and 12.7mm machine gun, it had been destroyed by a tow fired from this Bradley, but was promptly returned fired on by an anti-tank weapon, an HJ-08, destroying the vehicle as the roof-based forces and even the heavy machine gunners continued to fire and shredded up the M113s with relative ease, as the M113s were weak. As this APC was dismounting troops to get to the bridge, they took a position with the destroyed vehicle, although the gunner and driver were the only ones KIA'd as the dismounts got to the roof. These forces ran up and took position, firing everything they had, anti-tank weapons, their general purpose, and light machine guns like their Type 56-1s or the Chinese RPD, which was a squad automatic weapon used by the Pakistani forces, and they fired and got return fire, again, very briefly from the Americans, as they did not last long under the withering artillery strikes coming from the different firing batteries with 8 howitzers apiece of this battalion, as they focused their efforts on this battle at this moment in time, with very minimal efforts focused on this battle, although there were some as seen in the previous installment. But most of the fire was directed here to destroy the headquarters and logistical elements of the Mechanized Infantry, and also some of their troops themselves. As artillery strikes were called in by the ISR capabilities, they would hit and destroy Bradleys and M113s and troops with ease. As the missiles also came in and were hellishly destructive with their nearly 1,000-pound warheads, the battle was over relatively fast. Well, the Americans would fight valiantly, but they would never make it across, and the engineers would have completely cut them off and destroyed them from their elevated positions on roofs of these multi-floor buildings, as again, these were hotels and restaurants and shops and bars and everything you would expect to find in a touristy type area, at least in this area here, right across from downtown and this side of town. And just to the north of this is a working class neighborhood with some adobe style homes, some not, but they have their own small yards and everything. And down here, there's homes are a bit larger, but these forces again managed to only escape because they understood that the Chinese were not trying to destroy the highway, nor were their allies, such as these Pakistani forces. So they ran under the highway, but they could only follow it so far as, again, outside of the city, once again, this mechanized infantry battalion had destroyed these militia forces that clustered in the area and were now patrolling the area with their quadcopter assets to map out the real-time battlefield just outside of the city. And their companies were divvied up and could respond relatively quickly within their local area to any trouble that arose. As now, the mortar strikes and even loitering munitions from the Shahed-238s fired by the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade's dedicated combat drone company within the headquarters battalion of the 3rd Armored Brigade. There would be 5 of these committed to this battle, and they would slam into 2 technicals of armed civilians and even get this dismount right here that was right here when the Shahed-238 hit. They got these personnel and these personnel within these rubble buildings destroyed by crossfire already. The forces here were mortared, and there were also another Shahed grouping right here, and the rest were destroyed by the vectored tank fire as it was vectored with the combat engineers in an L shape up and down the streets, including from the tops of buildings, which could cover virtually this whole area. Although this was a 1.5 by 1.5 mile area in totality, the firepower and the number of forces present was simply too much. As all these forces tried to flee at the opening, they were annihilated by the air dropping of munitions from the J-10, as well as also from the artillery strikes that were ISR directed, and very few escaped with their lives. As these companies, there were 3 of them, 2 tank companies and 1 armored infantry company. As they moved through the area, they would lose 2 Talha APCs to similar attacks from personnel that were in caves, as the locals knew about some of the caves and clefts of rocks, and similar to what happened to the tank over here, they would lose 2 Talhas and 1 of their IFVs to Molotovs. So they would lose 1 tank, 1 IFV, and 2 Talha APCs, but this loss was very little, and the personnel that tried and attempted it were annihilated as these companies rolled right through this valley, linked up with this tank company, who, by the way, went by firing frag T shells at all of these forces as artillery was coming in to hit them as well. Also firing heavy machine gun fire, and they had staggered heavy machine guns to watch, and the angle and traverse of their weapons was lower to ensure they didn't do friendly fire to watch these homes, as some of these tanks in this column went through people's yards, so they were watching the homes with some of the machine gunners on these vehicles, while others were watching out and scanning their sectors of fire. And the tank guns all had interlocking fields of fire and had incredible range, and were hitting most of these personnel at the opening as these tanks moved through the area with their frag T shells or heavy machine gun fire, including using frag Ts on these technicals. And these personnel here, these technicals, they were all destroyed by a combo of frag T shells, 125mm, heavy machine gun fire from their turret-based gunners of their 12.7mm fire, as well as also coax machine gun fire, 7.62 by 54mm, for these tanks, as they were Chinese-made tanks, effectively, and the Pakistanis built them by license and renamed them the Al-Khalid. As now, the Pakistanis had lost some troops, and the combat medics had gone to check the vehicle that was destroyed by the TOW missile. Finding no survivors, they evacuated in their Shangji truck-based ambulance these forces, as well as finding maimed personnel over here, although there were some KIAs over here dismounted as well, as the fire from the American side was very brief but caused some KIAs. And they got the KIAs out, as well as the maimed who lost limbs. There were men that had from 50 cal fire from one of the M113s that swept the area. A man had stood up and effectively had his arm taken off, and there was a man that lost part of his leg, and so on and so forth. It was very morbid, and these forces had to be medevaced and treated by the combat medics on the spot, and they were rushed to the roof, which was the medevac area for the Russian Mi-17 pilots to fly in their flight surgeons, as well as their combat medical personnel from the 8th Combined Arms Army and the VVS, or Russian Air Force detachment, that was in the northern AO with them in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, primarily from the CCP regime property that was outside of Santa Fe, which a secret ICU and surgical center had been built over the decades that China had purchased properties, and where now many of these types of installations existed, and many dozens of coalition troops would be saved by these facilities, as they had some of the best surgical teams in the coalition, these Russian forces had hurriedly moved these Pakistani injured and maimed out of the area, although they had only lost a small number, effectively amounting to 2 squads of KIAs when it came to the forces lost to the Americans, and also the critically wounded that had to be medevaced were saved, but they were WIAs. There were several of them in total. And the forces over here had made it out of their vehicle safely. One had to roll around on the ground to put himself out, but the machine gun, turret gunner, and coax had swept the area of these personnel. As soon as they revealed themselves, they were cut down by the heavy hail of fire from the tanks following up behind the one on fire, and the crew that bailed went to other tanks, as was standard operating procedure, to have a way out, to be evacuated. As the same thing happened to a IFV, the Viper IFV of the Pak1stani Armored infantry troops being Molotoved, and the crew got out. One was injured by a shot to the arm, as it didn't hit his body armor, but hit his arm and caused a large bullet hole, but he was not KIA'd, but the vehicle was burning and they had to abandon it. The Molotovs that were produced had some different agents in them that made them burn longer and stronger, and there were certain professionals in the American forces that knew how to do this properly, and they made sure that these vehicles would burn and not have their fire extinguishing systems able to put them out. As it pertained to the Talhas, which were the weakest armored vehicle of all of the Pakistani forces, they had these in their armored infantry. They were fast and maneuverable, but they had weak armor. The Viper was better armored. It had rails for ERA plating on the front. It also had applique armor on the sides, but was not much better armored, but it was better armored. It can sustain more abuse, but the Talhas, the 2 of them and the APCs being destroyed, had the crews bail out to other vehicles, as the other vehicles would scoop them up and they would have to divvy up these squads into different vehicles because there would not be enough room otherwise. So they had to go into other Vipers and other Talhas, as these crews had to effectively split up at this point. They were safely evacuated out of the area. The man with the gunshot wound in the arm would be treated by their own medics, as this was not a serious wound. And as a result of the combat, the fighting that occurred, the tanks, as they moved through, once again, were firing, although they took some fire, as indicated by the green, even from up here in the hills. The small arms fire could do absolutely 0 to these tanks. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the forces that revealed their positions by doing this were thoroughly destroyed by 125mm fragmentation shells, or frag-T shells, as well as heavy machine gun fire and precision-guided artillery strikes from the Pak1stani ISR capabilities of their combat-level ISR drones, which were the workhorse of the target finding data. As for their tank forces as their own quadcopter asset, as well as the companies comprising the full combat engineer battalion, as again, this is only 3 companies when including the one moving up in a straight line and checking on the buildings to guard the rear flanks of these forces who had pushed out into this area to thoroughly control the bridges. There's 4 additional combat companies in the south, as well as the headquarters and support company that was nestled in the middle of all these forces for safety. As the combat engineer battalion was stretched out over a mile of the city, effectively, the forces held the line with minimal losses, and the Americans suffered massive losses, including armed reactionary civilians in the over 200, as there were 295 of them in this battle, including even some on the opposite side of the river, who were annihilated by the combo of the strafing of 30mm fire, the missile fire from the Ra'ad cruise missiles from the aircraft, as well as also the artillery fire, especially, which was savage, coming from the other artillery battalion on the east side of the river, whereas on the west side of the river they were primarily responsible for saturating this area with fire missions for their 155mm howitzers. And now the bridge had been held and the Americans failed to escape. They were utterly annihilated. There were not even any prisoners taken because the combo of the airstrikes, strafing, artillery fire, and ground-based fire from the enormously powerful Al-Fad IFVs with their 40mm fire, not to mention even all the fire in the hands of the dismounts, like their rocket-propelled grenade ammunition, anti-personnel or anti-armor, which the anti-armor was enough to destroy the American APCs like the M113, as well as also the massively more powerful Al-Qatans, as well as even the also very powerful HJ-08 anti-tank missiles. And all of this firepower led to a rapid demise of these mechanized infantry troops. Effectively speaking, the 1st of the 200th was no more, and all that was really left was their support platoon that had been put in the city with them to support them logistically from the battalion support company, as the rest of the platoons that formed that company were in the north in Santa Fe and were already destroyed or POWs by this point. And as the forces of the headquarters, the support platoon, rather, of the entire 1st of the 200th was lost in downtown at this point in time, they were spotted by the ISR assets and hit at exactly the same time that this was occurring, as one firing battery would begin the process of refiring against downtown, which was right across the river, and downtown extended quite a way to the highway junction of 40 and I-25, as downtown was relatively large. And a part of the battle that was occurring would be fought for the control of the junction by a Pak1stani Armored battalion that had already moved into the area and destroyed armed reactionary civilians and was continuing to move on. At the same time as this and the Reeves power plant capture was occurring, the fighting in downtown had reached its crescendo as the Iranian forces moved in early and surrounded this large grouping of armed reactionary civilians and was going street by street, block by block, building by building. All are guided, of course, their platoon level and their high altitude